Spring came late to the broken heart of Europe in 1945. The air over Germany hung heavy with smoke and silence, as if the very land had exhaled and forgotten to breathe again. Cities lay cracked open, their streets clogged with rubble and hollow-eyed civilians who no longer flinched at the distant growl of engines. For 6 years, the Wehrmacht had marched across continents under banners of iron will and blind certainty. Now, that certainty was gone, surrendered in ragged columns to an enemy they had been taught to fear as ruthless and uncivilized. Among those columns moved young men who had once believed themselves conquerors, but now felt like ghosts drifting toward an uncertain fate. One of them was Wilhelm Hartmann, a 23-year-old conscript from Hamburg, whose first battle had been his last. He still carried the smell of burned oil in his uniform from the retreat near the Ruhr. He remembered how his officer, a boy no older than he, had tossed his pistol into a ditch when the news of Hitler's death spread like a fever through the ranks. Wilhelm had expected chaos, executions, perhaps the cold shot to the back of the head, reserved for deserters. Instead, there had been only silence, an exhausted agreement that the war was over. He had surrendered to an American patrol the next day, hands shaking as he held his empty palms skyward, braced for whatever punishment awaited. The Americans who processed the prisoners were efficient, almost indifferent. They stripped the Germans of weapons, searched for party insignia, and wrote down names with bored precision. To Wilhelm's surprise, they neither struck nor spit. They handed him a cup of water. Another man, a former schoolteacher from Bremen, whispered in disbelief that the guards even smiled when speaking to each other. This was not how the enemy had been described in Nazi pamphlets, where Americans were portrayed as mongrels driven by cruelty and chaos. Yet these soldiers laughed quietly, smoked cheap cigarettes, and treated their captives like men rather than beasts. Still, fear lingered like a second skin. Rumors spread through the makeshift holding camps. They would be starved, humiliated, maybe forced to clear minefields with their bare hands. The Reich's propaganda had promised annihilation at the hands of the Allies. Some prisoners whispered of Soviet camps where men disappeared forever. Others claimed the Americans would send them to labor in salt mines until they collapsed. No one knew the truth, and the unknown was worse than any battlefield. The journey west began under gray skies. Columns of prisoners shuffled along muddy roads toward trucks and trains that would take them first to staging camps in France and Belgium. Wilhelm rode in a crowded cattle car with dozens of others, the smell of sweat and fear heavy in the air. Through the slats he glimpsed villages untouched by bombs, children staring wide-eyed at the procession of enemy soldiers. At night, the men murmured quietly about home, mothers left behind, cities in ruins, sweethearts lost to time. A few still clung to the fantasy of redemption, convinced that some miracle would restore Germany's honor. Most simply wanted to survive. Days bled into weeks. At Le Havre, Wilhelm saw the ocean for the first time. It was not the romantic sea of postcards, but a cold, gray expanse scattered with the hulks of Allied ships. He was herded with hundreds of others toward a waiting Liberty ship, its deck bristling with ropes and tar. The Americans shouted orders but did not strike. They searched each man for knives, then allowed them to board. The ship smelled of diesel and rust. Below deck, cramped bunks waited like coffins stacked 3 high. Men coughed, cursed, prayed. Some stared at the steel ceiling as if it might reveal their future. The Atlantic crossing was long and strange. Guards patrolled but rarely barked. They seemed young and tired themselves. Meals, thin soup, bread, sometimes meat, arrived at regular intervals. It was better than the rations many had eaten during the last winter of the war. Wilhelm tried not to think about his brother, last seen retreating from the Eastern Front. He tried not to imagine his mother sifting through rubble for food. Instead, he watched the horizon and wondered why his captors seemed almost normal. Once, An American sailor leaned over the railing and offered a cigarette to a group of prisoners. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Wilhelm's bunkmate took it, hands trembling. The sailor grinned, lit it, and walked away. It was such a small act that it rattled Wilhelm more than any shouted threat could have. When the coast of America finally appeared, a faint, smoky blur that hardened into skyline and cranes, an unexpected hush fell over the deck. New York, the city of endless lights, of jazz and skyscrapers, a place whispered about in barracks and propaganda leaflets alike. Wilhelm felt a strange stirring, not excitement, but awe tinged with dread. This was the enemy's heart, alive and unbroken, while his own homeland lay in ruins. He thought of Hamburg's charred streets, of his father's ruined tailor shop, and felt both envy and shame. They disembarked quickly, lined up beneath towering warehouses, while guards counted and recounted. Some Americans watched them with curiosity. Dock workers paused mid-shift to stare. Wilhelm met the gaze of a boy about his own age leaning against a crate. The boy didn't spit or jeer. He just looked, curious and unafraid, before turning back to his work. That silent, ordinary indifference was more disarming than hatred could ever have been. From New York, the prisoners were loaded onto trains bound for the interior. The landscape changed from steel to endless fields, then forests, then small towns with white churches and water towers. Children waved from porches. Some tossed pebbles or shouted insults, but most simply stared. The prisoners stared back, stunned by the sheer size of this country that had crushed their war machine yet seemed untouched by it. It was not rubble, but abundance that rolled past the train windows. Neat farms, full barns, people who looked fed and unafraid. In one rail yard somewhere in Ohio, Wilhelm and his companions waited for a new engine to arrive. They were allowed to stretch their legs under watchful eyes. A local farmer brought a bucket of water for the guards and, after a moment's hesitation, offered it to the prisoners too. The guard shrugged and allowed it. Wilhelm drank deeply, cold water spilling down his chin. He felt something loosen in his chest. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest fracture in the armor of fear. By the time the train reached the heartland, the prisoners were exhausted but alive, their expectations fraying with every mile. If the Americans had intended cruelty, surely it would have shown itself by now. Instead, there was order, food, and a strange absence of vengeance. The men began to talk less of punishment and more of survival, of work details and rumors that some camps even had libraries or orchestras. It felt dangerous to hope, but hope crept in anyway, quiet and persistent. When the doors finally slid open at a camp somewhere in the warm, dusty South, Wilhelm stepped down and felt the earth of America beneath his boots. Beyond the fences and guard towers, he glimpsed something utterly unexpected. A group of young American soldiers laughing, gloves in hand, tossing a white ball back and forth under the afternoon sun. The sound of leather popping, the easy rhythm of play, cut through the weariness like a crack in a wall. For a moment, Wilhelm forgot he was a defeated soldier. He simply stared, caught between confusion and wonder, as the enemy prepared for a game he did not understand. He didn't know it yet, but that simple scene, the clash of war and innocence, brutality and leisure, would unsettle everything he thought he knew about them and about the world he had served. The first breath of American air struck Wilhelm as warm and dry, carrying the scent of cut grass and something faintly sweet he could not name. After weeks of steel, salt, and fear, it felt alien to step onto solid ground again. Sunlight spilled across the camp yard in wide golden sheets, catching on the barbed wire that wrapped the perimeter like a silent warning. Guard towers punctuated the fence line, their rifles glinting in the light. But the men inside leaned casually, watching without menace. It was not the hell he had been warned of. It was orderly, almost quiet. The stillness broken only by the rhythmic thud of boots, as prisoners were marched toward registration. Rows of low wooden barracks stretched across the dusty compound. Each smelled of pine and sweat, a mixture sharp but not unbearable. Inside, double bunks lined the walls, mattresses thin but clean. Windows were propped open to let the spring air move through. Wilhelm dropped his canvas bag on a lower bunk and sat for a moment, stunned by the simple fact that there was bedding at all. Across from him, Ernst Becker, a wiry farmer from Saxony, with the face of a man twice his 26 years, traced a hand along the wooden frame and muttered, "Better than the trenches." It was not a joke, yet a small ripple of laughter passed between them. The laughter felt almost dangerous, like breaking a rule no one had stated. Food arrived before evening, trays of beans, bread, and meat so tender it nearly fell apart. Some men ate in silence, unsure if this was a trick. Others devoured every bite with animal urgency. Wilhelm chewed slowly, tasting fat and salt he hadn't known in months. Back home, his mother might be boiling weeds for soup. Here, the enemy fed him as if he were not an enemy at all. The dissonance was almost painful. Across the table, a boyish prisoner named Dieter whispered, "They want to make us weak. So, we won't fight." But his voice wavered, and even he seemed unconvinced. Days settled into routine with disorienting speed. Roll call at dawn, work details in the surrounding fields or lumber yards, evenings spent in the barracks or in quiet clusters outside. The guards kept watch but rarely barked orders. Red Cross trucks came through, distributing mail and ensuring humane treatment. Occasionally, an American officer walked the grounds, taking notes with a clipboard and polite nods. It was all so different from the grim fantasies that had haunted the Atlantic crossing that the men struggled to know how to behave. Hatred required cruelty to feed on. In its absence, it began to starve. Yet the wire was always there. It gleamed under the Texas sun, because Texas, they learned, was where they were now. The land was wide and flat, dotted with mesquite trees and far-off windmills. Some evenings, the air smelled of smoke from cooking fires beyond the fence, teasing the senses with reminders of normal life just out of reach. Wilhelm would stand by the wire after work, staring at the horizon, feeling small in a country so big it seemed endless. Freedom was visible but unreachable, and that distance gnawed at him more than any cruelty could have. It was during one of those first weeks that Wilhelm noticed the field. At first it seemed nothing more than packed earth hemmed in by chalk lines, with a rickety wooden backstop and a few splintered benches. But one afternoon, as the sun sagged toward the treetops, a group of American soldiers strolled out carrying gloves and bats. They wore loose-fitting uniforms and easy smiles, laughing in the way only men unburdened by defeat can laugh. Wilhelm stopped in his tracks, caught by the strange grace of their movements. The way a ball arced high into the sky, the sharp crack as wood met leather, the casual way players slapped each other's shoulders after a run. It was not a drill. It was joy, simple and unguarded, unfolding within sight of prisoners who had lost everything. The game fascinated and confused the Germans. Baseball was foreign, its rules opaque, its rituals odd. But more than the mechanics, it was the attitude that unsettled them. Here were their captors, relaxed and unafraid, playing as though the world beyond the fence was whole and safe. The war in Europe still sputtered in ruins, but on this diamond, it seemed to have vanished. For men raised on Nazi propaganda that painted Americans as decadent savages, the sight was almost unbearable in its contradiction. They were not monsters. They were happy. Ernst, usually stoic, muttered, "This is how they win. They live like the war is nothing." Dieter frowned, arms crossed, and said nothing. Wilhelm felt something shift deep inside, a slow cracking like ice breaking. He wanted to hate these men. It was safer that way. But watching them play, a game he didn't understand yet somehow recognized as freedom, made hatred feel thin and childish. These were not demons. They were human, and worse, they were content. Over the following days, more games appeared. Sometimes guards practiced batting during lunch breaks. Sometimes whole teams of GIs arrived, filling the yard with laughter and shouted bets. The prisoners lingered near the fences whenever work ended early, pretending indifference but secretly transfixed. A few men scoffed loudly, calling the sport childish. Others asked each other quiet questions. How is it scored? Why do they run in a diamond? The uncertainty of ignorance stung. They were soldiers stripped of power, and now even this simple spectacle reminded them how small they had become. Yet curiosity grew alongside unease. One evening, after a long day of hauling timber, Wilhelm found himself watching a lone GI practice pitching against a makeshift target. The man noticed his gaze and, to Wilhelm's surprise, tipped his cap with a grin before turning back to his game. No words were exchanged, but the moment lodged itself deep within Wilhelm's chest. An enemy soldier had greeted him as though he were simply another man. In the barracks that night, whispers rose. Some prisoners said the games were meant to humiliate, to show the Germans what true victory looked like. Others wondered if the Americans were simply bored. But Wilhelm sensed something quieter at work. The games weren't for the prisoners. They were for the players themselves. Yet, by being visible, by existing so casually in the shadow of war, they chipped away at the myth of the merciless enemy. A small library opened in the camp, stocked with English books and a few German translations. Work details became steadier, wages paid in canteen coupons. Life was still captivity, but no longer terror. And always, from somewhere beyond the barracks, came the faint echo of a ball striking a bat, of cheers drifting across barbed wire, like a language no one had taught them. One afternoon, while waiting in line for rations, Wilhelm overheard a conversation between two guards. A new shipment of sports equipment had arrived. Might even let the Krauts play if they're decent, one said, laughing. The other shrugged. Maybe. Better than them sitting around brooding. Wilhelm felt his pulse quicken. The idea was absurd and thrilling, a game shared across the divide of war. He said nothing, but his mind burned with it all evening. The sun set behind the fence that night, bleeding red and gold across the sky. Wilhelm sat on his bunk, staring at his hands, rough from work but still steady. He had survived battles, bombings, an ocean crossing, and the shame of defeat. Yet nothing unsettled him like the thought of stepping onto that field, of meeting the enemy not as prisoner or foe, but as something far more vulnerable, an equal. Outside, the sound of another game drifted on the wind. He wondered, for the first time, if the barbed wire might one day feel less like a wall and more like a boundary waiting to be crossed. The invitation came not as an announcement, but as a rumor that slithered through the barracks one sticky afternoon. Someone claimed the Americans were short a player. Someone else said the guards wanted to see if the Germans could hit a ball. By evening, the talk had taken on the fevered energy of a fairy tale. Tomorrow, a few prisoners might be allowed onto the diamond. Wilhelm tried to ignore it, but his pulse betrayed him. The idea was absurd. Still, he lay awake that night, imagining the crunch of dry earth beneath his boots, the sting of sunlight in his eyes as he stepped past the wire. Morning broke with the hum of cicadas and the smell of dust warming under a rising sun. Roll call passed uneventfully until a sergeant strode forward, scanning the lines with a half-smile. "You, tall one, and you, blonde kid. You two? Come with me." Wilhelm flinched when the finger landed on him. Ernst shot him a look that was half warning, half awe. The prisoners moved stiffly as they were led across the compound, past watchtowers and silent guards, toward the field that had haunted their evenings. The chalk lines glared white against the ochre dirt. Bats leaned against the backstop like sleeping animals. The Americans greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and easy camaraderie. "You ever play ball?" one asked, grinning as though the war had never existed. Wilhelm shook his head, mute. The man laughed softly, not cruelly. Guess we'll teach you. Gloves were tossed over. Their leather smelled sharp and unfamiliar. Wilhelm slipped one on, fumbling with the stiff fit, feeling suddenly clumsy and exposed. The game began not with ceremony but with a pitch, fast, clean, cracking into the catcher's mitt with a sound that made Wilhelm's heart jump. At first it was chaos. The German volunteers didn't know where to run or when to swing. They missed easy catches. They froze on bases. Laughter floated from the Americans, but it wasn't mocking. One tall corporal jogged over to show Wilhelm how to hold the bat, adjusting his stance with a gentle tap to the shoulder. Like this. Eyes on the ball. Wilhelm nodded, cheeks burning with a cocktail of humiliation and strange gratitude. When he finally made contact, the ball dribbled weakly into the dirt, but the Americans clapped anyway, whooping as if it were a home run. Something inside him eased at that sound. By midday, sweat slicked everyone's backs, dust clung to their trousers, and the barriers between them began to thin. Language stumbled but found ways to bridge itself through gestures and laughter. Ernst surprised everyone by snagging a pop fly with an awkward but successful dive, earning cheers from both sides. Dieter, who had mocked the game for weeks, watched from behind the fence, face unreadable. When Wilhelm jogged past him after a clumsy run to first base, their eyes met for an instant, Dieter's gaze sharp with a pride he wouldn't admit. After the match, they shared canteens of water under the sparse shade of a mesquite tree. No one spoke of ideology or defeat. They spoke of bats, gloves, and bruised palms. An American sergeant passed around chewing gum, grinning at the awkward way the Germans tried to chew and blow bubbles. For a fleeting hour, the war seemed impossibly far away. Wilhelm caught himself smiling. A real smile, not the guarded smirk of survival, and felt almost guilty for it. Yet the fragility of the moment hung heavy. Back in the barracks, some prisoners warned that this was manipulation, a clever trick to soften them. "Don't forget what they did to our cities," one man hissed, his voice brittle with loss. Wilhelm said nothing, but inside he wrestled with the dissonance. Hamburg still burned in his memory. His father's shop was gone, his friends scattered or dead. And yet these Americans, who had destroyed so much, handed him a glove and taught him to play. He could hate the bombers, but could he hate the boy who showed him how to swing? In the following weeks, games became a quiet ritual. Not every prisoner was invited, but spectators gathered at the fence each time, pressing close, as if the chalk lines were windows into another world. Some camps even organized their own leagues. The Americans lent bats and balls to keep boredom at bay. Wilhelm played whenever chosen, slowly learning the rhythm. The satisfying pop of a caught ball, the rush of running a base, the odd poetry of a sport with no clock, where the only time that mattered was the arc of a ball through open sky. He felt himself loosening, if only during those hours, but cracks ran deeper than camaraderie. One evening, after a long game and rare shared laughter, Wilhelm returned to find a scrawled message on his bunk. Vergus nicked. Don't forget. It wasn't signed, but he knew the sentiment. Some men feared that their hatred was all they had left. Letting it go felt like surrendering twice. Wilhelm sat for a long time with the note, its black letters stark in the fading light. He thought of the American corporal's patient hands correcting his grip, of the shared gum and water, of the way joy had felt like treason. He didn't know which side of himself would win. Meanwhile, whispers spread about Germany's ruin. Letters from home told of hunger, rubble, and new occupiers carving up the fatherland. Some men reacted with despair. Others clung harder to the camp's tiny joys. Baseball grew into something more than sport. It became a fragile lifeline, a way to stay human while everything familiar disintegrated beyond the fence. Wilhelm noticed how playing changed the atmosphere. Guards smiled more, tempers cooled, and even diehards who swore to hate forever found themselves leaning forward when a fly ball soared high. One afternoon, after an especially spirited match, the American sergeant clapped Wilhelm on the back. "Not bad, German. Maybe we'll make a ball player out of you yet." The words were teasing, but kind, and they landed with unexpected weight. For months, Wilhelm had been only a number, a defeated soldier. Now, in the mouth of his captor, he was something else, a man with potential, however small. It shook him more than threats ever had. Yet beneath the growing warmth lurked an unspoken question. What would happen when the wire finally opened? To taste this strange equality, only to return to a shattered home steeped in shame and suspicion, what kind of man would that leave behind? Wilhelm tried not to dwell on it, but the thought hovered like storm clouds at the edge of a clear sky. The last game of the summer came with a breeze that hinted at autumn. The prisoners fielded their own full team by then, uniforms cobbled from donated scraps. Americans and Germans mixed freely on the benches, joking in a mishmash of English and broken German. As Wilhelm stepped to the plate, the camp seemed to hold its breath. The pitcher, a lanky GI with a crooked grin, wound up and sent a fastball spinning. Wilhelm swung, and for the first time the bat connected cleanly, sending the ball soaring beyond the field. Cheers erupted from both sides, sharp and joyful. He jogged the bases in stunned silence, heart pounding not with victory, but with something stranger. The realization that for a heartbeat, no one on that diamond was enemy or captive. They were just men chasing a ball under a vast American sky. He touched home plate to a chorus of cheers and a playful shove from Ernst. But as the sound faded, Wilhelm glanced toward the fence. Beyond it lay a world still divided, still wounded. Somewhere past the horizon, Germany waited, hungry, broken, and unrecognizable. He wiped sweat from his brow and caught the eye of the corporal who had first taught him to swing. The man raised a hand in salute. Wilhelm hesitated, then returned it, a tiny gesture that felt immense. In that moment, he sensed the truth waiting for him beyond the games. The war might be over, but the hardest battle, learning what to believe now, was only beginning. Autumn bled quietly into winter, and the camp's rhythms softened like an old song. The games slowed, the fields hardened under cold winds, and rumors of repatriation began to stir. Wilhelm felt the news as both promise and threat. Freedom, once an abstract dream, was suddenly near. But so was the question he had tried to avoid. Who was he now? Months earlier he had marched under a flag of conquest. Now he was a man who had laughed with his captors, shared water, learned a foreign game. The hatred he had been fed no longer fit, yet neither did forgiveness come easily. Hamburg still smoldered in his memory. His father's shop was gone. His younger brother's fate remained a silent ache. And yet, when he closed his eyes, it was the crack of bat against ball and the easy grin of an American corporal that rose first. Ernst handled the news differently. The wiry farmer had come to cherish the simple order of captivity. Food each day, work that felt useful, the quiet dignity of routine. "Freedom sounds good," he muttered one night, sitting on the bunk opposite Wilhelm. "But what's waiting out there? Hunger? Ruins?" He stared at his calloused hands, hands that had caught flyballs and hauled lumber alike. "Sometimes I think we've lived better here than we will at home." It was not treason, just truth. Wilhelm didn't know how to answer. He thought of his mother's letters, short, weary, describing soup lines and burned neighborhoods. Perhaps Ernst was right. The Americans, too, seemed to sense the turning season. Guards grew more relaxed, but also more distant, as if preparing to let go of the strange fraternity that had formed. The corporal who had taught Wilhelm to bat, his name was Jack, Wilhelm had finally learned, stopped by less often, busy with new assignments. When they did meet near the fence, their talk was halting but sincere. Jack spoke of a farm in Iowa waiting for him, of baseball leagues that might resume after the war. Wilhelm found himself asking questions, imagining a life beyond uniforms and ideology. "You'll go home soon," Jack said one afternoon, leaning on his bat. "Make it better than what brought you here." The words landed heavy and stayed. Departure came not with ceremony, but with orders barked at dawn. Prisoners lined up with meager belongings, faces taut with conflicting emotions. Some wept quietly, others stood blank, armor rebuilt against the unknown. Wilhelm felt as if he were shedding a skin he had only just grown into. When he passed the baseball diamond on the way to the trucks, it sat empty, chalk lines fading, bats stacked like forgotten relics. For a heartbeat, he saw the summer again, the laughter, the dust, the improbable fellowship, and felt a pang sharp enough to stop his breath. The ship home was colder than the one that had brought them west. Men were thinner, quieter, carrying memories heavier than luggage. Wilhelm sat on deck often, staring at the horizon, replaying moments like film. His first clumsy swing, Ernst's improbable catch, Jack's easy smile. Each scene felt like a seed planted in soil he had not known he carried. Could such small kindnesses survive the ruin waiting at home? Could they matter at all against rubble and bitterness? Hamburg greeted him with gray skies and streets that seemed to mourn. Buildings stood like broken teeth. People moved with the weary caution of survivors. His mother embraced him fiercely, but with eyes dulled by loss. Friends had vanished, swept away by bombs or surrender. The city felt stripped of certainty, just as he was. Yet as he walked its ruins, he noticed his own quiet rebellion against despair. When a starving boy lingered near the bread line, Wilhelm found himself sharing a crust without hesitation. When talk turned to hatred for the victors, he felt it snag against the memory of a bat placed gently in his hands. Ernst wrote months later from a small farm in Saxony. His letter was blunt but hopeful. "We are poor, but alive. I teach the children to work and to laugh when we can." Strange, isn't it? Sometimes I think of that game. Wilhelm smiled reading it, recognizing the same fragile thread that bound them to the humanity they had seen behind the wire. Years passed. Germany clawed its way out of ruin. America faded from daily thought, but not from the deep, private places where memories linger. Wilhelm built a life among the ashes. Work, family, small joys that felt radical after so much darkness. Yet, each summer, when his sons begged to play ball in the dusty lots of their neighborhood, he joined them. His swing was clumsy, his stance imperfect, but he taught them what he had learned in captivity. Keep your eye on the ball. Trust the arc. Run even when you're afraid. He never told them where he'd learned it. Some lessons didn't need the weight of confession. The war had taken much, friends, cities, illusions, but it had given him one unlooked-for truth, that enemies could be more than the stories told about them, that humanity could flicker even in the shadow of barbed wire. It was a quiet revelation, but it changed everything. He carried it like a secret weapon against cynicism, proof that the world could surprise you with grace. One night, years later, long after his children had gone to bed, Wilhelm sat alone and listened to a radio broadcast about post-war reconciliation. Voices spoke of treaties, rebuilding, and the long road from hatred to peace. He thought of Jack's parting words. "Make it better than what brought you here." For the first time, Wilhelm felt he might be doing just that. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he still saw that first day in Texas, the diamond shimmering beyond the fence, the sun burning high, the enemy laughing like ordinary men. He remembered the shock that cracked his fear, the small beginnings of change. War had tried to make him a weapon. Baseball, improbably, had reminded him he was human. The memory was both wound and healing, a paradox he would carry to his grave. Somewhere, he imagined, Jack might still be playing on quiet Midwestern fields, unaware of the life he had helped reshape with nothing more than a glove and a smile. The thought was enough to make Wilhelm whisper a silent thank you to the night. In the hush of his modest room, the echo of a bat meeting ball still rang, gentle but unyielding, a sound that had once cut through barbed wire and, somehow, through him.